She's just a glorified paper pusher in logistics. That's how my own mother introduced me to 23 elite guests at my brother's engagement party. Instantly, the Golden Boy CEO smirked and twisted the knife. Exactly. She's never seen a real combat deployment. But before I could even open my mouth, the bride's mother dropped her silver fork onto the marble table. She wasn't just a regular society wife. She was a 4-star general, the woman I'd met exactly once, 18 months ago, inside a top-secret Pentagon briefing room. She pinned her dead-cold eyes on me and whispered exactly 7 words, just one sentence. And my mother's arrogant face instantly drained of color, pale as a corpse. Before I tell you what those 7 words were, take a second to hit like and subscribe, especially if you've ever been humiliated by your own blood just because you didn't look good on their resume. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. This story might be the exact answer you're looking for. Right now, to understand the sheer weight of what the general said at that table, let me take you back 10 years. Back to the night this family officially labeled me an unsalvageable disgrace. 10 years ago. My father, Arthur, worked for the Department of Veterans Affairs. He spent 40 hours a week buried under a mountain of administrative red tape, rubber stamping disability claims for guys who had left pieces of themselves in the sandbox overseas. You'd think a lifetime of processing paperwork for shattered soldiers would teach a man something about backbone. It didn't. Arthur was a coward of the highest order. He lived his life in cheap gray polyester suits from JCPenney that always bagged at the knees. Whenever my mother Evelyn spun up into one of her psychotic, status-obsessed rages, Arthur had a routine. He'd shove his hands deep into his pockets round his shoulders until he looked half his size and stare a hole into the scuffed baseboards. He'd let out this pathetic, avoidant little throat-clearing noise. Ahem. And then he would walk away. He lied to himself. He called it keeping the peace. He convinced himself that standing by in dead silence while his daughter was psychologically gutted was just the price of keeping the house from burning down. He wanted a quiet life, but his silence was the weapon that did the most damage. It told me every single day that I wasn't worth the friction. The house we lived in wasn't a home. The living room was a meticulously curated museum, a shrine dedicated entirely to the golden child, Julian. My brother was 4 years younger than me. He smelled constantly of expensive aerosol hair gel and unearned arrogance. Julian made a killing in the defense contracting sector. He brokered weapon systems and security software on pristine white paper. He sold the tools of war from a climate-controlled office in downtown DC, safely insulated from the blood, the dirt, and the body bags. Yet Evelyn treated him like he was Captain America. My mother was a bitter woman. Decades ago, she missed out on a mid-level diplomatic post at the State Department because she got pregnant with me. She never let me forget it. Since she couldn't have the Washington elite lifestyle she craved, she weaponized her children to get it. Julian was her ultimate proxy. She plastered the living room walls with his business degrees, his local 30 under 30 newspaper clippings, and those tacky gold-plated plastic awards that caught the glare of the recessed lighting. I was the opposite. I was the ghost in the hallway. The disappointment. Whenever company came over, usually other middle-class suburbanites desperate to project old money, Evelyn ran the exact same script. I can still smell the roasted lamb and the cheap Chardonnay. She would stand at the head of the dining table, tapping her manicured nail against her wine glass to command the room. Julian just locked down $1 billion security contract. She'd announce, her voice dripping with manufactured pride. The table would ooh and ah. Then she'd pause, a calculated theatrical beat. Her eyes would slide over to where I sat at the far end of the table. The pride would vanish, replaced by a cheap, suffocating pity. And Elsie, she'd sigh, shaking her head. Well, she's still holed up on some base doing odd jobs, sweeping up logistics. She likes to play it safe. Julian would smirk behind his napkin. Arthur would suddenly find his green beans incredibly interesting. And the guests would give me that tight-lipped, sympathetic nod reserved for the family failure. In that house, a person's right to breathe was measured purely by their corporate ROI. If you couldn't be paraded around a country club mixer, you were garbage. I didn't scream. I didn't throw plates against the wall. I didn't cry in my room. You don't survive a toxic environment by bleeding out in the open. You learn to detach. You learn to observe your abusers with the cold clinical detachment of a sniper scanning a tree line. I watched them. I mapped their insecurities. I became steel. But the absolute limit of my endurance snapped during the summer I turned 22. I had just walked across a university stage. I held a diploma with honors, top of my class. It meant absolutely nothing to them. To Evelyn, an undergraduate degree was just the primer coat. She had already mapped out the rest of my life, ready to mold me into her next shiny accessory to show off to the neighbors. It was late August. The heat in the kitchen was oppressive, thick and sticky. The old Kenmore refrigerator in the corner was humming a loud rattling buzz. I was sitting at the Formica table, drinking a glass of tap water. Evelyn marched into the kitchen. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how my day was. She just stopped at the edge of the table and slammed a heavy, glossy booklet down onto the surface. The smack of the heavy paper echoed off the tile walls. I looked down. It was an admissions brochure for Harvard Law School. The refrigerator kept buzzing. The air in the room went entirely dead. The heavy, glossy Harvard Law admissions brochure hit the cheap Formica table with a loud smack. The sound bounced off the kitchen tiles, sharp and demanding. The old Kenmore refrigerator in the corner kicked into a loud, rattling hum. The August heat inside the room was thick, sticky, and suffocating. I did not flinch. I sat perfectly still in my plain gray cotton t-shirt. My spine was straight, my shoulders squared. I looked directly into Evelyn's eyes. "I am not going to law school," I said. My voice was completely flat, no shaking, no hesitation. I reached into my manila folder. I pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper and slid it directly over the Ivy League brochure. It was Department of the Army Form 4.1, United States Army Enlistment Contract. "I am shipping out for basic training," I stated, keeping my eyes locked on hers. "I am going into the Special Forces pipeline." She did not even look down at the paper. She just stared at me. 1 second, 2 seconds, 14 seconds of dead heavy silence ticked by. The air in that cramped kitchen turned to concrete. It felt like sucking in exhaust fumes. I just sat there regulating my breathing, watching the vein in her neck start to throb against her pale skin. Then the dam broke. Evelyn exploded. She shrieked. It was the high-pitched grating sound of a woman who had just been robbed of her most prized accessory. "You want to be a glorified maid," she spat. She slammed her hands down on the counter so hard the tendons in her wrists popped. "You want to throw away the reputation of this family to go pick up garbage in some godforsaken war zone? Are you out of your mind?" Right on cue, Arthur shuffled into the kitchen. He wore his faded brown corduroy slippers, his shoulders hunched forward, looking like a whipped dog avoiding a rolled-up newspaper. He glanced down at the military enlistment paper on the table and immediately groaned, rubbing his face with both hands. "I already told the guys down at the VA office that you got into Harvard," he muttered. He refused to look me in the eye. "How am I supposed to walk in there on Monday morning? They are going to ask questions. You are making me look like an absolute fool." Not a single word about my safety. Not a single question about my future. Just his pathetic water cooler gossip. He processed disability claims for shattered soldiers all day. But in his own house, a uniform was just a social embarrassment. My phone vibrated violently against the table, rattling against my glass of water. The screen lit up in the dim kitchen. A text message from Julian sitting comfortably in his air-conditioned bedroom just 20 feet down the hall. "You are making Mom cry again. Stop trying to play the hero and just do what you are told." I looked at the glowing screen. I looked at Arthur, who was now intensely studying the scuff marks on the linoleum floor. I looked at Evelyn, whose face was flushed purple with rage, her chest heaving as she prepared her final ultimatum. "If you walk out that door for this," Evelyn sneered, pointing a trembling manicured finger inches from my face, "you are done. I will cut off every single cent. No money, no phone plan, no support. You can go scrub toilets in the dirt for all I care. You will be nothing." I did not argue. I did not explain myself. I stood up. I pushed the wooden chair back. The legs scraped loudly against the floor, cutting through her yelling. I turned my back on them and walked out the rear door. The night air was humid and smelled like cut grass and damp earth. The wooden planks of the back porch creaked under my boots. Sitting on the rotting porch swing in the dark was the only person in that entire bloodline who actually understood the weight of a uniform. Grandma Margaret. She was 78 years old, a former Army nurse who had pulled 30-hour shifts in freezing field hospitals during the Cold War. She did not cry. She did not yell. She just sat there in the shadows, pulling a long drag from a Winston cigarette. The burning red cherry cast a faint glow over her deep, weathered wrinkles. She stood up slowly and crushed the cigarette under the heel of her shoe. She reached deep into the pocket of her faded wool cardigan. She grabbed my right hand. Her fingers were bony tough and felt like old leather. She pressed a thick, heavy roll of $20 bills firmly into my palm. $800. Right on top of the cash, she dropped a metal chain. I looked down. It was a dog tag, pitted, scratched, and spotted with decades of brown rust. My grandfather's tag. The metal was ice cold against my skin. Margaret looked me dead in the eye. Her voice sounded like grinding gravel. "Keep this," she commanded. "For the nights when the tracer fire keeps you awake, you look at it and you remember that you have the blood of actual warriors in your veins. Let the rest of them rot in their clean offices." I nodded once. I did not go back inside to apologize to my mother. I did not beg Arthur for understanding. I slipped the rusted metal chain over my head. The cold steel settled right against my collarbone. It felt heavy. It felt like armor. I walked straight to my room, grabbed the heavy olive drab duffel bag I'd packed 3 days ago, and slung it over my shoulder. The thick canvas strap dug hard into my muscle. I walked out the front door and let the screen door slam shut behind me. An hour later, I stood on the cracked concrete of the downtown station platform. The smell of thick diesel exhaust and stale rain filled my lungs. The Greyhound bus idled loudly at the curb, its massive air brakes hissing violently in the dark. I stepped onto the bus, walked straight to the back, and sat down on a cracked vinyl seat. The engine roared to life. As the bus pulled away from the curb, I looked out through the yellow-tinted, grimy window. I watched the manicured lawns, the pristine driveways, and the bright porch lights of my family's neighborhood slowly fade into the pitch-black night. I leaned my head against the vibrating glass. I closed my eyes, and I did not look back a single time. The military recruiters sell you a polished commercial, sharp uniforms, flags waving in the wind, crisp salutes. Reality is just dirt noise and the copper stench of blood. 3 years after I got on that Greyhound bus, I was eating sand at a remote outpost in the Middle East. Julian was back in Washington, D.C., wearing a tailored suit, closing defense contracts on pristine white paper. My contracts were negotiated in mud, sweat, and spent brass. I didn't push paper. I pushed combat gauze into open chest wounds. I learned the exact tearing sound a cat tourniquet makes when you rip the Velcro open under heavy incoming fire. I learned how to drop a target at 300 yards just to keep myself breathing. The smell of burned cordite and dried blood baked deep into my pores. You can scrub with heavy lye soap until your skin is raw, but that smell never washes out. It becomes part of you. It was 0:30 after a massive raid went completely sideways. We made it back to the forward operating base. I was standing in the center of the compound, covered in chalky white dust and someone else's blood. Earlier that week, the battalion commander had pinned silver bars to my collar. Captain Elsie Allen, an 03 in the United States Army. I wasn't thinking about the rank. I was standing under the harsh, blinding glare of a halogen work light, looking down at Master Sergeant Carlos Mendez. Carlos was 47, 3 kids back in Texas, a lifer who treated his unit better than he treated himself. The contrast between him and my family was a bitter pill. Back home, my mother measured worth by zip codes and country club memberships. Here, worth was measured by who ran toward the gunfire when everyone else hit the dirt. 2 hours ago, in a pitch-black alleyway, Carlos threw his entire body weight into me. He shoved me hard into a drainage ditch, just as a mortar shell ripped the earth apart where I had been standing a second before. He took the jagged shrapnel meant for my spine. Now the medics had him flat on a canvas litter. The heavy olive fabric was soaking through. A dark, wet stain spread rapidly beneath his ribs. He gritted his teeth, his face pale and slick with cold sweat under the dirt. The medics were moving fast, hands stained red, shouting for a medevac bird. The desert wind whipped up, throwing fine, stinging sand against my face. The temperature drops fast at night out there. It cuts right through your fatigues. I unvelcroed a pouch on my tactical vest and pulled out the heavy black satellite phone. I wiped the grit off the screen with my thumb. My hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from the massive adrenaline dump slowly crashing out of my system. I just needed a tether, one normal human connection to ground me before the helicopters arrived. I dialed the area code for Virginia. The static hissed in my ear. A harsh digital crackle. 3 rings. Hello. It was Evelyn. Her voice was sharp, irritated, like I had just interrupted her favorite TV show. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I'm glad you're alive." "Are you tired of being a bullet sponge yet?" she asked. The ice clinked in her glass. I could picture her standing in her pristine kitchen holding a glass of cheap Chardonnay. I swallowed hard. My throat felt like sandpaper. I stared at the medics cutting Carlos's uniform open with trauma shears. "I just made Captain Mom." A pause on the line. The satellite delay stretched the silence. Then a heavy theatrical sigh. "Right," Evelyn said. Her voice dropped into that familiar mocking tone. Ice cold. "So what does that mean exactly? Are you still handing out boots in a warehouse, or did they finally promote you to mopping the mess hall?" My grip on the thick plastic phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. I could hear the faint murmur of the television in the background on their end. Cable news commentators arguing. The domestic comfort of it all was nauseating. They were sitting on plush leather furniture while the air I breathed tasted like diesel exhaust and panic. Before I could even formulate a response, the receiver fumbled. Arthur's voice cut through the static. "Elsie, listen!" he rushed out. His voice buzzed with that pathetic, desperate need to agree with my mother. "Your brother just closed a massive deal. Cybersecurity software, 7 figures. The boy is an absolute genius. He's the one actually protecting the country right now. You should have seen the clients looking at him." I stopped listening. The words faded into a dull, meaningless buzz. He's the one actually protecting the country. I looked over at Carlos. He let out a low, ragged groan as a medic shoved packing gauze deep into the shrapnel wound. Blood pooled on the rubber soles of his combat boots. Blood dripped onto the sand. Julian was drinking expensive scotch in a high-rise building, selling lines of code. Carlos was bleeding out on a canvas cot to keep me breathing. And the people who shared my DNA, the people who slept safely under the blanket of security we provided, thought my uniform was a janitor's outfit. A profound freezing numbness washed over me. It started in my chest and spread to my fingertips. The last remaining ember of hope I had for my family, the childish, stupid wish that they might eventually respect me, snuffed out completely. My jaw locked. The muscles in my neck pulled tight like steel cables. I didn't yell. I didn't curse at them. I didn't owe them my anger. They weren't worth the calories it would take to raise my voice. I looked at the bulky phone in my hand. I stared at the red button. My thumb pressed down. Beep! The line went dead. The hissing static vanished. I slipped the phone back into my vest and secured the Velcro. I didn't call back. Not that night. Not the next day. I closed a massive, heavy steel door in my mind, locking them out entirely. For the next 7 years, I let them live in their delusional little bubble, worshipping their golden boy and his paper contracts. I let them think I was nothing. I turned my back on the darkness, walked over to Carlos's stretcher, and knelt in the bloody sand. 7 years is a long time to keep a door shut. I spent those years building a life out of Kevlar, classified ink, and graveyard shifts. Today, I am Major Elsie Allen, 04, Military Intelligence and Special Operations. My apartment near the base is bare. No gold-plated trophies on the wall. No framed newspaper clippings. Just a solid oak desk, a heavily encrypted laptop, and a single dented brass casing from my first firefight sitting next to my black coffee mug. Underneath my shirt, my ribs and right shoulder carry thick, jagged ridges of scar tissue. They ache with a dull, throbbing heat when the barometric pressure drops. The public does not know my name. But in the windowless secure rooms of the Pentagon, they know exactly who I am. 18 months ago, I planned and commanded Operation Vanguard. It was a black book mission. High risk, zero public footprint. My team went into a hostile sector under the cover of a sandstorm, neutralized 14 high-value targets, and pulled 42 international hostages out of a concrete basement. I did not do it for a medal. I did it because it was the job. But the President of the United States pinned a silver star on my chest anyway. I took it home, wrapped it in a piece of cloth, and locked it in a dark drawer. My family knew none of this. To them, I was still the stubborn dropout sorting boots in a dusty supply closet. We barely spoke, usually just forced holiday texts. So when my phone vibrated on a Tuesday night with Julian's caller ID, I almost let it go to voicemail. "I am getting married," he announced. No greeting, just the brag. He talked for 10 straight minutes about his fiancée, Clara Sterling. She was a corporate lawyer, Ivy League naturally. Julian was practically hyperventilating over her pedigree. Her dad is Senator Richard Sterling, Armed Services Committee. Julian boasted, the smugness radiated through the speaker. He plays golf with the biggest defense contractors in the country. This is huge for my firm, Elsie. "Congratulations," I said. My voice was flat. "And her mother," Julian continued dropping the name like a winning lottery ticket, "is Victoria Sterling. You know, since you were in the Army, you might have actually heard of her. 4-star general. Massive deal at the Pentagon." I stopped wiping down my kitchen counter. The wet rag froze in my hand. General Victoria Sterling. I had met her exactly once, 18 months ago. I stood at attention in a subterranean soundproof briefing room at the Pentagon. General Sterling sat at the head of the heavy mahogany table. She listened with a stone-cold expression to my risk assessment for Vanguard. She looked me dead in the eye, picked up a heavy steel pen, and signed the execute order that sent my team into the dark. Julian was still talking, blissfully ignorant of the collision course he was setting up. "They are hosting an engagement dinner this Saturday at the Capitol Grill in D.C. Mom wants you there. Try to look presentable, and please do not embarrass us." Saturday night, the private dining suite smelled of dry-aged ribeye steaks, expensive bourbon, and old money. I arrived 20 minutes early. I wore a tailored black silk blouse and dark slacks. No uniform, no rank insignias, just civilian clothes. Julian was already there, sweating through the collar of his expensive tailored suit, pacing aggressively across the thick carpet. When his phone rang, he jumped. "It is the caterer," he muttered, tossing his iPhone onto the cold marble table. He rushed out into the hallway to yell at whoever was on the other end. I stood alone in the room. I picked up a glass pitcher and poured ice water. On the table, Julian's iPhone screen lit up. A notification pinged. I did not mean to snoop. But the banner text glowed bright blue against the dark marble, and the group chat name caught my eye instantly. Allen Family Updates. There were 3 people in that chat, Evelyn, Arthur, and Julian. I was not included. I never was. A new message from my mother popped up on the lock screen. "Evelyn, do whatever you have to do tonight, Julian. Just do not let Elsie talk about her military job." The Sterlings are high society elite. They do not need to know we have a daughter doing low-class logistics work. Change the subject if you have to. Another ping. Julian had replied from the hallway. "Julian, relax, Mom. I will shut her down early. She has never seen a real deployment anyway. She has absolutely nothing to brag about." I stood completely still. The ice shifted in my water glass with a soft clink. I did not grab the phone. I did not smash the glass against the wall. The anger that hit me was not hot or explosive. It was freezing cold. It was the absolute clinical clarity of a sniper locking onto a target. They had plotted this. They had formed a coordinated strategy to hide my existence. To them, the blood I left in the sand, the scars on my ribs, and the silver star in my drawer were just dirty little secrets. A stain on their pristine corporate image. They were preparing to publicly strip me of my dignity just to kiss the ring of a senator. I set the glass down. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling the familiar tight pull of my scar tissue. The military intelligence mindset took over. Emotion is a liability. Leverage is everything. They had no idea who was walking into this room. They had no idea I already held the ultimate trump card. I reached up to my collar. Underneath the smooth black silk, the cold rusted metal of my grandfather's dog tag rested against my skin. I pressed my thumb against the rough edge of the steel. There would be no more quiet retreats. No more keeping the peace to protect a family that despised me. I turned toward the heavy oak double doors, just as the maitre d' pulled them open. I could hear Evelyn's fake, overly enthusiastic laugh echoing from the hallway. The Sterling family was arriving. The trap was set. I let my hands drop to my sides, squared my shoulders, and walked directly into the kill zone. 23 people sat around a massive mahogany table inside the private dining suite at the Capitol Grill. The air in the room was thick. It smelled of dry-aged ribeye, roasted garlic, and the heavy, suffocating scent of expensive floral perfume. Crystal water glasses clinked. Heavy silver forks scraped quietly against fine white china. This was Washington, D.C. elite territory, a room built purely for power plays and networking. Evelyn was holding court. She wore a dark blue silk dress that probably cost more than my first car. She glided around the room with a glass of champagne in her hand, schmoozing the Sterling family and their political friends. She was exactly where she always wanted to be, swimming in a pool of old money Senate connections and corporate defense contractors. She talked loudly. She made sure everyone at the table heard about Julian's latest business deals. She threw around words like cyber infrastructure and tactical software integration, like she actually knew what they meant. She laughed at jokes that were not funny, and right on schedule with her little group chat strategy, she treated me like a piece of ugly furniture. I sat near the end of the long table. I wore a simple black silk shirt. I kept my back perfectly straight, my shoulders squared. I did not drink the wine they poured. I just sat in silence, watching her play the crowd. I watched her trade my dignity for a few scraps of social leverage. Senator Richard Sterling sat across from me, Clara's father. He wore a custom-tailored gray suit and had the polished, easy smile of a career politician. He finished chewing a piece of steak, wiped his mouth slowly with a white linen napkin, and leaned forward. He rested his forearms on the table and looked right at me. "So, Elsie," the senator said, his voice deep and genuinely polite. "Julian tells us plenty about his firm. He's quite the salesman. But what is it you do?" I took a breath to answer. I did not even get the first syllable past my teeth. "Oh, Elsie is also in the military," Evelyn cut in. Her voice sliced right across the heavy oak table. She smiled at the senator, but her eyes were completely dead. She deployed the exact practiced tone of fake sympathy she had been using to demean me since I was a teenager. "She works in the army." Evelyn continued, waving her hand dismissively, like she was swatting away a fly. "But she just does some low-level logistics work. You know, pushing papers, counting boots in a warehouse somewhere. She likes the safety of a desk." A few of the guests gave that tight, uncomfortable, polite nod. The kind of nod people give when they pity you. Julian leaned back in his heavy leather chair. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive suit jacket. He swirled the red wine in his glass, watching the dark liquid coat the crystal. A smug, greasy smile spread across his face. He looked at his fiancée Clara, then at his future father-in-law, and decided to drop the hammer. He wanted to make damn sure the Sterlings knew he was the only actual warrior in the Allen family. "Exactly," Julian sneered. His voice carried easily over the quiet jazz music playing from the ceiling speakers. "Elsie has never seen a real combat deployment. She wouldn't know the first thing about the actual weapon systems my firm provides to the Pentagon. Honestly, she probably doesn't even know what actual gunpowder smells like." Dead silence fell over our end of the table. I looked at Arthur. My father was sitting right next to Julian. He was wearing a slightly better suit than his old J.C. Penney rags, but the man inside it was exactly the same coward. Arthur stared down at his half-eaten mashed potatoes. He hunched his shoulders, cleared his throat with that familiar, pathetic little noise, and gave a non-committal shrug. He backed them up with his silence. He let his son publicly gut his daughter just to keep his own seat at the table comfortable. Underneath the heavy linen tablecloth, my right hand curled into a fist. My nails dug hard into my palm. I felt the heat rising in my chest, the raw, violent urge to reach across the mahogany, grab Julian by his expensive silk tie, and bounce his face off the marble centerpiece. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my wrist under the table. It was Grandma Margaret. She sat to my left. Her bony arthritis-swollen fingers gripped my arm with surprising violent strength. Her nails dug into my skin. I could feel her entire arm shaking, not from old age, from pure, unadulterated rage. She glared at Evelyn, her jaw set tight, her breathing heavy and ragged. I reached over with my left hand and gently squeezed her fingers, a silent command to stay down. I did not snap. I did not yell. I did not defend my honor to a table full of civilians. I just looked at Julian. My face was a stone wall. I kept my breathing slow and even. 2 seconds in, 2 seconds out. I stared directly into my little brother's eyes with the cold, dead focus of a sniper settling a crosshair right between a target's eyes. Let him talk. Let him dig the hole a little deeper. He thought he held all the cards. He thought his little paper empire made him a god in this room. I felt the cold, rusted steel of my grandfather's dog tag pressing against my chest under my shirt. I waited. My military training taught me one absolute rule of engagement. You never interrupt an enemy when they are in the middle of making a fatal mistake. Julian kept smiling, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his wine, basking in his own fake glory. Then, out in the hallway, heavy footsteps approached. The brass handles of the private dining room doors turned. The doors burst open. The heavy oak doors swung open. They did not slam, but the sound was enough to kill the noise in the room instantly. General Victoria Sterling walked in. She was not in uniform. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and dark slacks, but the fabric did not hide the authority radiating off her. It was a physical presence. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop 5 degrees the second her leather heels hit the hardwood floor. Evelyn's fake, high-pitched laughter cut off mid-sentence. Her mouth hung open slightly. Senator Richard Sterling stood up immediately. He smiled, relieved to see his wife, but even he straightened his posture. The rest of the table followed suit, scrambling out of their leather chairs. Julian bumped his knee hard against the table leg in his rush to stand up, spilling a few drops of red wine onto the white linen. General Sterling did not rush. She stepped into the private dining suite with the slow, deliberate pacing of an apex predator scanning a new environment. She nodded to a few of the political guests. She shook hands with Arthur, who wiped his sweaty palm on his pants before reaching out. She tolerated a brief, overly familiar hug from Evelyn. Her eyes scanned the long mahogany table. Then they locked onto me. She stopped walking. I was standing at the end of the table, spine-rigid, shoulders squared. I did not move. I held her gaze with the absolute locked-in focus required when facing a 4-star commanding officer. For half a second, there was a flicker of genuine surprise in the general's steel-gray eyes. It was a micro-expression. The slight raise of an eyebrow, the slight tightening of the jaw. She was processing the data. She was matching the woman in the black silk blouse standing at this ridiculous DC engagement dinner to the combat officer she had authorized to drop into a hostile compound 18 months prior. She recognized me. I could see the exact moment the memory clicked. Her eyes flicked down to my right shoulder, then back up to my face. She knew exactly what it cost for me to stand up straight. General Sterling took 3 slow steps forward. The room was dead silent. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic thud of her low heels. She bypassed Evelyn entirely. She ignored Julian's outstretched hand. She stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. "Major Allen," the general said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It cut through the quiet room like a serrated combat knife. "It is a rare honor to see you off base." Evelyn let out a weird, strangled gasp. Julian's outstretched hand slowly dropped back to his side. He blinked rapidly, looking at the general, then looking at me, his brain completely failing to process the audio. Major. The word hung in the air. To my family, it was a foreign language. They had spent the last 10 years convincing themselves I was a warehouse janitor. I gave a sharp, perfectly measured nod. "The honor is mine, General," I replied. My voice was completely flat, zero emotion. General Sterling did not break eye contact with me, but I could see the cold calculation happening behind her eyes. She had walked in halfway through Julian's little speech. She had heard the tail end of his smug monologue. She had heard him say I'd never seen a real deployment. She had heard him say I didn't know the smell of gunpowder. She knew exactly what kind of snakes were sitting at this table. She pulled out the heavy leather chair directly across from me. She sat down slowly. She smoothed the lapels of her blazer, keeping her movements incredibly controlled. The rest of the guests awkwardly sat back down. Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing. She shot a panicked, wide-eyed look at Arthur. Arthur just stared at his plate, sweating bullets. "Please," General Sterling said, gesturing to the table with one hand. "Do not let me interrupt the celebration. Continue." But the air was ruined. Julian looked like he had just swallowed a golf ball. He reached for his water glass, his hand shaking slightly. The ice clinked against the crystal. Evelyn, desperate to regain control of her social standing, let out a nervous little chuckle. "Oh, General Sterling, we were just talking about Julian's new cybersecurity contract. You know how important defense work is these days." General Sterling did not look at my mother. She kept her laser-focused gaze pinned entirely on me. "I do know how important it is," the general said quietly. She reached out and picked up her own water glass. "I know exactly who does the real work and who just sells the paper." Julian flinched. The subtle, lethal insult landed right between his eyes. I sat perfectly still, watching them squirm under the weight of an actual leader. If you have ever had to sit in silence while arrogant, fake people took credit for your hard work, you know exactly how sweet this moment tasted. Hit that like button right now if you know the feeling. Drop a comment below and tell me, I know the feeling, so I know I'm not the only one who has had to deal with this kind of corporate garbage. General Sterling took a slow sip of her water. She set the glass down silently on the linen tablecloth. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. She wasn't going to yell. She wasn't going to cause a scene. She was just going to sit there and let them keep digging their own graves. I looked at Julian. He was staring at me, real fear finally creeping into his eyes. The protective bubble of his mother's delusion had just been popped. I rested my forearms on the table. The trap was sprung. The door was locked. Now it was time to let the predator off the leash. The waitstaff cleared the salad plates and brought out the main courses: bone-in ribeyes, seared sea bass. The room smelled of truffle butter and roasted asparagus. Evelyn, completely blind to the thick tension hanging over our end of the table, stood up again. She picked up a heavy crystal wine glass and a silver spoon. Clink, clink, clink. The high-pitched sound forced everyone to stop eating and look at her. She smoothed the front of her expensive silk dress and put on that overly dramatic, long-suffering mother face. She sighed, looking down at me with practiced pity. "I just want to say how incredibly proud I am of Julian," Evelyn announced, her voice dripping with fake emotion. "He's building a real legacy, a legacy of actual protection for this country." She paused. She looked at me. The condescension in her eyes was toxic. "And Elsie. Well, this is our daughter, the one who chose to hide behind logistics paperwork instead of making a real impact like her brother. She likes to play it safe." Julian gave a slow, self-satisfied nod. That arrogant, punchable smirk bloomed on his face. He actually reached out and patted Arthur on the shoulder, like two men sharing the burden of a disappointing woman. 3 seconds of dead silence followed. Then General Victoria Sterling slowly placed her heavy silver fork down on her plate. It didn't clatter. She set it down with total control. The general did not look at Evelyn. She turned her head, her steel-gray eyes locking onto Julian. Her gaze was ice-cold. It was the look you give an insect before you step on it. "Julian," General Sterling said. Her voice was low, but it commanded every square inch of that room. "Did you just say your sister has never seen a real deployment?" Julian's smirk faltered. He blinked, confused by the sudden shift in the air pressure. He opened his mouth to answer, maybe to crack another joke about my warehouse job, but he didn't get the chance. The general did not wait for his answer. She snapped her head toward me. Her voice boomed sharp and thunderous, echoing off the mahogany walls. "Major Allen, tell your family where you were 18 months ago." Evelyn panicked. The title Major finally registered in her social climbing brain. She saw her perfect DC dinner party slipping out of her manicured hands. "Oh, General," Evelyn stammered, waving her hands nervously. She just knocks around some supply base. I am speaking to my officer, General Sterling roared. The words sliced through Evelyn's fake polite voice like a machete through wet paper. Evelyn's mouth snapped shut. She physically recoiled, shrinking back into her chair. Arthur stared at his water glass, his face completely pale, sweating through his collar. General Sterling reached into the inner pocket of her charcoal blazer. She pulled out a heavy solid brass coin. A 4-star General's Challenge coin. She tossed it. The heavy metal coin hit the marble table right in front of Evelyn's plate with a sharp, violent crack. 18 months ago, the general stated, her voice hard and uncompromising, Major Elsie Allen planned and commanded Operation Vanguard, a classified direct action raid behind enemy lines. She breached a hostile compound. Her team neutralized 14 armed terrorists and pulled 42 international hostages out of a basement alive. The entire room of 23 people stopped breathing. Senator Sterling set his wine glass down, looking at me with sudden, intense respect. The general wasn't done. She stood up. She planted both hands flat on the table, leaning forward, dominating the space. She did not hide behind a desk. General Sterling continued, her voice dripping with absolute disgust as she looked at Evelyn. She took a bullet to her vest and shrapnel to her ribs to make sure her men got out. She wears the silver star on her chest, hand-delivered by the President of the United States. Evelyn's face drained of all blood. She looked like a wax figure melting under a heat lamp. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. General Sterling turned her lethal gaze back to Julian. Your paper defense contracts, the general sneered, are absolutely worthless garbage without the blood of actual combat operators like your sister. Julian's jaw hung open. His bottom lip trembled violently. The smug golden boy CEO facade was entirely shattered. He looked small, pathetic, a fraud exposed in his own temple. He looked down at the table, unable to meet the eyes of his fiancée Clara, who was now staring at him in complete shock. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not need to rub their faces in it. The damage was total, absolute, and permanent. I sat perfectly straight in my chair, my shoulders squared. My hands rested calmly on my lap. I looked directly into General Sterling's eyes, my face a mask of cold, unbothered stone. Mission accomplished, General, I said quietly. Senator Richard Sterling broke the dead silence. He turned his head slowly, looking directly at my father. The politician's polite practice smile was gone, replaced by deep, visceral disgust. You have an actual hero sitting at your table, Arthur, the senator growled. His voice was low, but it carried a heavy, dangerous weight. And you sit there staring at your plate and let your son disrespect her like that in front of my wife. Arthur choked. He tugged frantically at his cheap shirt collar. Sweat beaded heavy on his forehead, dripping down the side of his face and catching in the stubble on his jaw. He opened his mouth, but only a pathetic, raspy squeak came out. He looked back down at his half-eaten mashed potatoes, spineless to the bitter end. He couldn't even look the senator in the eye. Evelyn realized the ship was sinking. Her grip on the elite social circle she worshipped was slipping through her fingers. She immediately deployed her ultimate weapon, the fake victim routine. Crocodile tears pooled instantly in her eyes. Her bottom lip quivered with perfect practice timing. Oh, Richard, please, Evelyn stammered, holding a manicured hand to her chest. She forced her voice to crack. We had no idea. Elsie never tells us anything. She shuts us out. If I had known my own daughter was in danger. Smack! A bony-veined hand slammed down on the heavy mahogany table. Silverware jumped. Water spilled over the rims of the crystal glasses, soaking into the white linen. Grandma Margaret stood up. She leaned heavily on the table, her knuckles white, glaring at her daughter-in-law. Her voice was pure, rusted iron. You knew, Margaret snarled. The entire room flinched. Do not sit there and lie to these people, Evelyn. Margaret continued, pointing a crooked finger right at her face. I was there. When she called from the sandbox covered in her buddy's blood, you mocked her. You asked if she was mopping floors. You chose to be deaf and blind because her uniform didn't print money for you to show off at the country club. You make me sick. Evelyn's face twisted into something ugly. The aristocratic facade cracked wide open, exposing the rotting core inside. She pushed her heavy leather chair back so hard it screeched violently against the hardwood floor. She lunged around the table, grabbed my forearm, and dug her acrylic nails deep into my skin. Outside. Now! She hissed through her teeth, her breath smelling of sour wine and panic. I let her pull me. Not because she was stronger, but because I wanted this isolated. I let her drag me out through the heavy double doors and into the dim, narrow corridor outside the private suite. Julian scrambled after us, desperate to escape the glare of the general. The heavy doors clicked shut behind him, cutting off the quiet jazz music and the hum of the restaurant. Out here, the air felt cold and tight. The hallway walls were lined with dark, polished stone. It felt like a bunker. Evelyn let go of my arm and spun around. She was panting heavily. Her expensive silk dress looked rumpled. The mask was entirely gone, revealing the rabid, status-obsessed animal underneath. "Are you happy now?" Evelyn shrieked. She pointed a shaking finger an inch from my face. "You did this on purpose. You humiliated me in front of the Sterlings. You set Julian up just to ruin his future. You always ruin everything." Classic Evelyn. Deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. I just took a bullet for a living, but somehow she was the one bleeding on the carpet. She didn't care that I almost died 18 months ago. She only cared that she looked bad at dinner. I glanced over her shoulder. Julian was pressed against the cold stone wall. His custom suit hung loose on his frame. He was actually crying. Real pathetic tears tracked down his cheeks. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. The fake CEO had just realized he spent the last hour bragging about paper weapons to a woman who had pulled real triggers. He realized he was nothing. I did not back away. I did not yell back. I took one deliberate step forward, closing the distance between me and my mother. I squared my shoulders, locked my jaw, and looked down at her. I used the exact same physical presence I used when interrogating hostile combatants. Total, lethal dominance. Evelyn felt the shift in the air. She instinctively took a step back, her high heels stumbling awkwardly on the thick carpet. Her shoulder blades hit the stone wall. She was trapped. I leaned in close. My voice was a dead, flat whisper. "I did not ruin Julian," I said, my eyes boring a hole right through her skull. "You did. You chose to be blind to my uniform. You built a glass house entirely out of lies and fake prestige. And tonight your own arrogance threw the rock that shattered it." Evelyn swallowed hard. She pressed herself flat against the wall, her eyes wide with actual fear. For the first time in 32 years, she realized I was not the quiet, compliant punching bag she raised. I was a weapon, and she had just looked down the barrel. I broke eye contact and turned my head slowly toward Julian. He flinched, shrinking further into the corner. He brought a shaking hand up to wipe his nose, smearing snot across his expensive silk cuff. "Julian," I said. His name tasted like ash in my mouth. He looked at me terrified, waiting for the execution. "You wanted to know about real deployments." I told him, my voice completely devoid of pity. "You just survived your first one. Remember what it smells like?" I didn't wait for his response. I didn't care if he cried harder. I turned my back on both of them, leaving them to suffocate in the hallway of their own making. I grabbed the heavy brass handles of the double doors and pushed them open, stepping back into the dining room for the final verdict. I pushed the heavy brass doors open and stepped back into the private dining suite. The room was completely dead. The clinking of silver, the hum of quiet conversation, the forced laughter, all of it was gone. 23 pairs of eyes locked onto me. Senator Sterling looked completely exhausted by the sheer level of dysfunction he had just witnessed. General Sterling sat in the exact same position I had left her, arms crossed, face entirely unreadable. I did not walk back to my seat at the end of the table. I stood near the head of it. I kept my posture locked into a rigid parade rest stance. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the stale perfume-heavy air into my lungs. "I love this family," I said. My voice echoed off the mahogany walls. It was steady, unbreakable. "But I will never, under any circumstances, sit at a table with people who disrespect the uniform. I will not break bread with people who mock the blood and bone of the men and women who died beside me." Evelyn burst through the doors behind me. She practically fell into the room, her hair messy, her silk dress twisted. The panic in her eyes was wild, like a cornered animal realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. "You can't just leave!" Evelyn shrieked, stumbling forward. She reached out, trying to grab my shoulder. "I am your mother. You owe me." "Sit down, Evelyn." The command did not come from me. It came from the end of the table. Grandma Margaret slammed her palm down on the wood again. Her voice was pure gravel. "Let her go." Evelyn froze. The absolute authority in the old nurse's voice nailed her to the floor. Arthur didn't even look up. He just kept staring at his plate, sweating. I ignored my mother completely. I walked over to where Grandma Margaret was sitting. I dropped down on one knee right next to her chair, a proper military sign of respect. I looked up into her weathered, heavily lined face. I saw the fierce, uncompromising pride shining in her wet eyes. I reached under the collar of my silk blouse. I grabbed the cold metal chain. With one sharp tug, I pulled it over my head. My grandfather's dog tag. The rusted, pitted piece of steel I'd worn against my skin for 10 years. I stood up. I walked over to the spot where Evelyn had been sitting. I placed the chain and the heavy metal tag down on the marble table right next to her untouched wine glass. Clack. The dry metallic sound echoed in the quiet room. A final punctuation mark. A total transfer of the burden. I didn't need the metal armor anymore. I was the armor. I turned. I locked eyes with General Sterling. I gave her one crisp, deliberate nod. She nodded back. A silent acknowledgement between two soldiers leaving a hostile environment. I did not look at Evelyn. I did not look at Julian, who was still hiding in the hallway. I turned my back on the entire room and walked out. I kept my head high, my steps measured and even, all the way down the long carpeted corridor of the restaurant and out into the muggy DC night. I drove my battered black Jeep Wrangler 11 miles out of the city limits. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't roll down the windows. I just gripped the steering wheel and drove until the streetlights thinned out and the heavy traffic faded. I pulled into the empty parking lot of an old brick church in a quiet Virginia suburb. The lot was deserted, lit only by a single flickering amber street lamp near the dumpster. I killed the engine. The sudden silence inside the cab was deafening. I reached into the pocket of my slacks. Before I had walked out of the restaurant, Grandma Margaret had pressed a folded piece of thick cream-colored paper into my hand. I flicked on the dim overhead dome light. I unfolded the paper. It was a handwritten note. The cursive was shaky, written by a hand that had spent a lifetime working too hard. Elsie. Your mother inherited my fear, but you inherited my courage. Stop waiting for them to see you. The right people in this country have already seen exactly who you are. I read the words again and again. Stop waiting for them to see you. I folded the paper carefully and placed it on the dashboard. I gripped the thick leather of the steering wheel with both hands. My knuckles turned white. I closed my eyes. And for the first time in 10 years, the steel wall I'd built around my chest cracked. The first tear was hot, stinging my eye before it tracked down my cheek. Then another. Then the dam completely failed. I gasped for air. I slumped forward, resting my forehead against the hard steering wheel. I cried. I didn't just shed a few quiet tears. I wept. I sobbed with the ugly, violent, gut-wrenching force of a decade of suppressed grief. I cried for the 22-year-old girl who walked onto a Greyhound bus alone. I cried for Carlos bleeding out in the sand. I cried for the absolute, crushing exhaustion of trying to prove my worth to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. The heavy sobs shook my entire body, echoing in the cramped, dark cabin of the Jeep. It hurt. It felt like my ribs were physically breaking apart. But with every ragged breath, the toxic weight of my family's expectations was leaving my system. The gaslighting, the constant need for their approval, the suffocating shadow of the golden child, it was all washing out. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes burned. I cried until there was absolutely nothing left. I sat back in the driver's seat. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. My chest felt empty, but for the first time in my life, the emptiness didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like clean space. It felt like freedom. I reached down and turned the ignition key. The Jeep's engine roared to life, loud and reliable, in the quiet night. I put the truck in gear, pulled out of the empty church lot, and drove into the dark. It takes exactly 48 hours for a glass house to completely shatter. McLean, Virginia is a wealthy insular suburb. It is a town that runs entirely on gossip, social currency, and political connections. Word of what happened inside that private dining room at the Capitol Grill spread like a wildfire in dry brush. Evelyn's fake, carefully constructed empire collapsed overnight. The country club elites she spent decades kissing up to suddenly stopped returning her calls. Her lies were exposed. The woman who paraded around town acting like American royalty was outed as a fraud who had spent 10 years hiding a Silver Star recipient just to stroke her own ego. My phone vibrated constantly on my kitchen counter. The screen lit up with dozens of notifications. Arthur sent 6 long text messages. They were full of pathetic, spineless apologies. "I should have spoken up, Elsie. I am your father. I am so sorry. Please just call me back. Let's talk about this like a family. Too little. 10 years. Too late." I deleted the thread without replying. Then came the voicemails from Julian. I listened to the first one just to hear the sound of his reality caving in. He wasn't a smug golden boy CEO anymore. He was actually sobbing into the receiver. His breath hitched in his throat. "Elsie, please," Julian begged, his voice high-pitched and frantic. "Clara called off the wedding. Senator Sterling pulled his endorsement of my firm. The Pentagon contractors are dropping my software packages. I am losing everything. My investors are walking. Please, Elsie, just call the general. Tell her you forgive me. Just fix this. Please." I stared at the blinking red notification light on my phone. I didn't feel sorry for him. I didn't feel a sudden urge to play the protective older sister. He had built his entire career by standing on the throats of other people. He built his pride by mocking the people who actually bled for this country. Now gravity was just doing its job. I tapped the screen. Block caller. I did the same for Arthur. And Evelyn. Block, block, block. 3 quick taps against cold glass. That was all it took to sever the rotting dead weight I had dragged behind me for 32 years. The silence that filled my apartment afterward was absolute. It was peaceful. My laptop pinged softly from the oak desk, a secure encrypted email notification. I opened it. The sender was General Victoria Sterling. It wasn't a social check-in. It was a formal set of orders. The general was officially requesting my transfer to the Pentagon. She wanted me on her personal staff as a direct tactical advisor to the Joint Chiefs. She didn't want paper pushers. She wanted operators who knew what the dirt actually tasted like. I closed the laptop. I walked into my bedroom and opened my closet. I pulled out my Army service uniform. The dark blue fabric was perfectly tailored. The brass buttons were polished until they mirrored the room. I dressed slowly. I pinned the ribbons to my chest. Every single one of them was earned in the dark, in the mud, and in the crosshairs. I drove to the military installation in Northern Virginia. The morning air was biting cold, cutting right through the lingering summer humidity. I walked through the heavy steel gates of the security checkpoint. The rhythmic, solid thud of my boots on the asphalt felt like a heartbeat. Standing just past the checkpoint, leaning slightly against a concrete barrier, was Master Sergeant Carlos Mendez. He looked older. The gray in his hair was thicker. He leaned his weight heavily on his left leg, a permanent reminder of the shrapnel he took for me in that desert alleyway. But he was wearing his uniform, and he was breathing. Carlos saw me walking up the path. He pushed himself off the concrete barrier. He stood up perfectly straight, ignoring the pain in his leg. He snapped a crisp, razor-sharp salute. His eyes crinkled at the corners with a deep, knowing smile. "Good morning, Major," Carlos said. His voice was rough, familiar, and grounded. I snapped my hand up to the brim of my cover, returning the salute. "Good morning, Master Sergeant." I dropped my hand. We didn't need to hug. We didn't need to cry. We stood shoulder to shoulder, looking out over the sprawling, heavily fortified military base. This was my family. The people who understood the cost of the uniform. The people who didn't demand I shrink myself to make their egos feel bigger. I looked up at the sky. It was a sharp, clear, unforgiving Virginia blue. My brother had stood in front of 23 people and confidently stated that I had never survived a real campaign. He was dead wrong. I had just survived the most brutal, grueling, and exhausting campaign of my entire life. I fought a 10-year war inside a toxic house. I fought to protect my sanity, my dignity, and my right to exist without apologizing for it. I established a boundary made of solid steel, and I walked away from the battlefield with my head held high. I didn't need to display the silver star to prove my worth. The quiet, unshakable pride in my own chest was the only medal I would ever need. What about you? Have you ever bled for people who treated you like a ghost? Have you ever sacrificed your time, your money, and your mental health only to be labeled the invisible failure of your family? I want you to know something right now. You are not alone. And your silence, it is not weakness. It is preparation. It is the tactical pause you take before you finally set your boundaries and take your life back. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic blood to protect your own peace, I want you to hit that like button. Hit subscribe so we can keep building a community of people who actually get it. And I want you to drop a comment below. Just type, "I chose my peace." Let the world know you survived your own campaign. Do not wait for toxic people to validate your existence. The right people, your real family, will always see your true worth.